Hey, welcome to another video on Dandy TCG, and this time we'll be looking into Expanded in the Pokemon TCG, as some of the upcoming regionals in the States will be featuring Expanded as the format to play in. Now, with the recent bannings this season in Expanded, a lot of people are trying a lot of different decks. Zoroark took a hit with the banning, so probably going to see, or we're already seeing a huge downtick on it, but there's whispers of it still being pretty buff. However, one deck that gave its run for its money last season was actually Drampa Garb, which I'm going to look at today. Drampa Garb looks to disrupt the opponent with Righteous Edge to set back decks that run high counts of special energy, while also setting up Garbodor's Garbotoxin to shut off any abilities that the opponent's decks may rely on, while also threatening the huge knockouts in Garbodor's Trash Lance attack to punish any opponents that need to go off quickly to use lots of items. But again, with the downturn of Zoroark, this deck probably took a hit too with losing its key matchup, losing a representation in its key matchup. So we'll see how this goes. Portland will be like the big test. There have been a lot of cups and challenges and Expanded lately leading up to the regionals, so it'll be interesting to see what comes out on top. I wanted to feature this deck still though because I think that the power of Garbodor, both Trash Lance and Garbotoxin, are powerful enough to kind of keep the deck relevant in an meta where there's a lot of contenders going in and no one really knows what the top deck to gun for is. So having kind of those safe options like Garbotoxin to just negate any sort of ability hedging, or like being able to take out special energies with Righteous Edge are pretty safe plays to me. But I gotta be honest, this doesn't seem as powerful as you'd think it'd be, just because a lot of decks seem faster than this kind of deck, as it does rely on a little bit of setup. But let's get on to the deck list. I'm running, as you can see here, I'm running two Drampa-GX. Righteous Edge is a way to disrupt the opponent in the early game, just to set them back on any special energy they try to attach. Especially with the loss of Puzzle of Time, it's a little bit more difficult to recover them while there are still options. There's just one less way to recover them, so a little bit good there. Berserk is your attack that you kind of want to set up in a lot of matchups. Being able to hit 150 and then with the Choice Band 180 against EXs and GXs is a way to take those big knockouts. And with Big Wheel GX, it's actually pretty good, a pretty good attack to use in this deck, because sometimes you're just gonna have really weird hands to work with and you just want to ship it away and see a fresh hand. Of course, we're running the Garbodor line, and I'm opted to go with 3-1 split of the Tool Drop Trubbish and one of the Garbage Collection Trubbishes from Noble Victories. This Trubbish has Tool Drop attack. It's a really great attacker, even though it doesn't really seem like it. The deck runs 8 tools, and if your opponent isn't really playing around it, they could get punished heavily by equipping too many tools to the board, or just enough to get any knockouts really. But I think if you're playing against any players familiar with this matchup, they'll be wary to equip tools, but sometimes they just gotta play into it or ignore it, and that's when you could attack with Tool Drop. This other Trubbish has Garbage Collection. Pretty nifty way to get key cards back in like those long matchups, but I haven't really personally found a time to use it, but seems like a good one to have. You can always probably just put in a 4th Tool Drop if you don't want to use it or if you don't have access to it. Now Tool Drop can be turned on with Dimension Valley, but you can also just pay the 2 costs with 2 energies in this deck, but sometimes it's kind of painful attaching that. Next we run 2-2 split of the this Garbotoxin Garbodor and this Trashlands Garbodor. Garbotoxin is really one of the ways this deck can stay relevant because there's so many decks, especially in Expanded, that rely on abilities. It's a great way to just turn it off and kind of set the playing field to your level. Also, this Garbodor has Trash Lines, which can again punish anybody that's trying to combo off by using a ton of items, or they kind of like need a setup and they spam a lot of items, or even in the long games where sometimes players are forced to play items. But this setup right here could probably be shifted from like a 3-1 Trash Lance Garbodor ratio if you feel like you want to attack the fighting decks more in this format, or you could set a 2-2 to kind of prepare yourself against like the more ability focused decks and set up against some of those greedy combo decks. I chose to use this Garbodor. There's also another one that has Garbotoxin in Expanded, but with a Dimension Valley and 2 attachments on this Garbodor, you can actually attack with Offensive Bomb. The other one requires I think 2 Psychics and then DCE or something like that, so it's a little bit harder to set that one up, but this one can actually be pretty useful in those matchups where there's Psychic weakness, or if you're in like real trouble and need to turn on like status ailments. Finally, running 3 Lele's. This deck needs access to its supporters. There's a lot of one-ofs. There's a lot of like weird hands you get in this deck, so having a way to get into a draw supporter is key. So we're running 3 Tapu Lele's. And don't underestimate Energy Drive, because it could deal a lot of damage to certain decks like Garbodor or anything that needs to pile energy on, even in the mirror match too. Next up, got a couple of tech Pokemon. This Sudowoodo has Roadblock. Basically, your opponent can only bench 4 Pokemon while this ability is active. It's another way to kind of hate on those Skyfield decks, or decks that need to use all 5 slots, that need to like set up a Brigette or need to set up multiple support Pokemon or like bench warmers. But with the downturn in Zoroark, it seems like you could probably cut this for something else. However, I still think Roadblock is a good way to... It was a good tech to have just in case decks need to like bench multiple Shaymins or Tapu Lele's to like set up or something. And finally, our last tech is this Oricorio, the Psychic one with Supernatural Dance and Revelation Dance. This might not be necessary. This is pretty much in the deck for Night March. If you're not scared of Night March, you could probably make room for another tech Pokemon. Also, the Supernatural Dance was pretty good. Again, fighting those Eggs decks, because sometimes they'd have to bench several Executes to get a knockout, like a one-hit shot on like say a Drampa. So if they're not careful, you may be able to like sneak a quick knockout on those Executes if they have too many Pokemon in the discard. But again, that can be cut if you feel like you don't need to tech against Skyfield decks like Zoro Eggs or Night March. There's a lot of Psychic attackers that the deck could run, like the Mews that have like the Encounter Mew or Mewtwo with Psychic, stuff like that. Next up, going into the supporters, I got a lot of one-ofs. Start with these. Teammates, great great supporter and expanded, a way to just access your DCEs or like things that could set up extra knockouts on those turns, following up a knockout on your side of the field. So pretty useful to have overall in a lot of expanded decks. Next up, Brigette. A deck that relies on evolutions like this one. It's no different from anything else that in the last format where Brigette was seen as a lot of common turn 1 supporter play. You want to usually bench like 3 Trubbish depending on the matchup. Sometimes you could grab, don't forget you can also grab a Drampa with this deck, as it doesn't specify GXs in the restriction. And we also run 1 Guzma. Guzma is a way to target down key Pokemon on their bench, while also being a way to take out Pokemon they're trying to stall in the active. Next up we have 1 Acerola. Great way to heal off Pokemon that are tanking damage like Drampa, or anything they're trying to stall in the active with. Anything they're trying to stall in the active with like higher tree costs again, like Drampa or even Garbodor, without a Float Stone. Also, a lot of common ways. There are a lot of common ways to turn on Acerola's effect, like if they use in expanded, if they use like Hypnotoxic or something like that, or any other poison effects. Onto the draw supporters, a couple more 1-ofs. Got Cynthia. I think 1's enough in this deck. I think you kind of want to be aggressive in your hand sometimes, and I think being able to just shuffle, while being able to shuffle your resources back in is good. Sometimes you don't really want to see it more than once. And also because we need to make room for Colress, because he also shuffles in and could potentially draw a ton of cards. And speaking of shuffling in, we got 3 N's. Now N, this deck could go, this deck could fall behind in a lot of matchups, which opens up a key play with evolving into a Garbodor, attaching Float Stone to turn on Garbotoxin, and then hitting them with an N, leaving them stranded with small hand size and no way to activate abilities without removing that tool from Garbodor. So I think 3 is a good way, or a good number to have for N. It does turn on some key moments in the deck. And finally, 3 Juniper, Keycrunch Juniper, Sycamore, whichever you want. Basically, you just want to draw aggressively. Sometimes this deck has a fair amount of like 1-ofs and like tech cards that you might not necessarily need, so being able to just pitch them and just get them out of your deck to help thin out and just put the good pieces you want in is pretty key. Moving on to items. So you got 4 VS Seekers. That's a way to get those 1-ofs, supporters back. Any draw supporters you might need. Running a split here of search items. Got 2 Ultra Ball, 2 Mysterious Treasures. The majority of the deck is Psychic, so being able to use Treasure is a huge upside. However, it does, again, like Drampa is one of the key Pokemon in this deck, so sometimes you just need to have the Ultra Ball. The Mysterious Treasure, though, does help reduce, like, it's a really big help when we're trying to reduce costs in the early game when you're trying to conserve resources in your hand. But Mysterious Treasure is one of those ways to just get out a quick Lele or Trubbish Garbodor or whatever with just 1 card. And don't forget, Sudowoodo could be searched out if your opponent opens with what do you call it, the Broken Hill. And to finish off the 1-ofs of items, got 1 Field Blower, a couple recovery cards in Rescue Stretcher, and our A-Spec of choice in Comp Search. Field Blower can just basically get off any Float Stones on pivot Pokemon on your opponent's side, or muscle bands, choice bands that they have attached. Any tanking items, tanking tools. And don't forget, you can even turn off your own Garbodor if you need to. Sometimes that might be the thing to do. Just turn off Garbodor to have a way to have access to a Tapu Lele and then attach again. Kind of costly, but sometimes it could save you. Sometimes you could find a game in those instances. We have a split here of Rescue Stretcher and Super Rod. With such a thin line of Garbodors in a 2-2, it's really important to keep track of them, and sometimes you may need to discard them or they get knocked out, but it's important to kind of make sure you're able to string Garbodor matchup, or Garbodor, Trubbish and a Garbodor in a lot of matchups, so it's key to have Stretcher in here with the modal, like the modal ability. Super Rod, another one of those things where you need to get back energy in this deck sometimes. We're only running 4 Psychic, so again, keeping track of those in case you need to discard them early to a painful Juniper or something. You just need to get them back in your deck for the last couple knockouts. A great way to get back energy and Pokemon. Finally, the A-Spec, Comp Search, really good way to have get access to like your teammates, DCE, basically any way to find like your knockout on certain turns or any setup turns. The alternative would be probably Item Finder, Dowsing Machine. I've seen a lot of the decks at top run Dowsing Machine, but I like Computer Search, but pretty much up to you. On to the items. Simple yet heavy line. 4 Float Stone, 4 Choice Band. Float Stone, you just gotta have Retreat in this deck with heavy retreat cost in the deck. Great attachment for Garbodor, Garbotoxin. Not much else to say on that front. And Choice Band, we ought to use this over, say, like a split of Muscle Band, simply because that 10 extra damage does add up a lot in a lot of instances. You hitting 180 with the Berserk turned on, and Trash Lines, you just want to max out on damage sometimes, especially if your opponent's just trying to play around it. Now the stadiums, interesting split here. I couldn't really decide on which one to go for. Got 2 D-Valley and 2 Parallel. I can see the Parallels being cut for more D-Valleys, especially as this meta seems to be seeing less Zoroarks, as we've noted earlier. But the 2 very powerful stadiums, especially in this deck. D-Valley reduces the cost on Tool Drop, which is huge. For Oricorio, makes the attacks free. Garbodor is like, while it probably won't come up often, reduces those attacks, but one also. If you try to run another Pokemon, you could use Mimikyu with the Copycat attack that makes it 1 Psychic. So it's really powerful stadium to have in this deck. And again, with Parallel City, having several ways to clear your opponent's bench to turn off like any huge Ridus beating numbers, in addition to wiping away key bench warmers on their side that they want to keep, or like set up Pokemon. Just the versatility of it's like so huge. And don't forget, you could in this format you could flip this perfectly fine, and you'll be content with reducing damage on stuff like the Kiawe decks or the Volcanion decks. Maybe even was it Combi, Vespiquen decks? Who knows? There's a lot of versatility there. I mean, some water decks too. Maybe even like it'll help against Archeosaurus. We'll see. But mainly using for the reduced bench size, because the Skyfields are key in this format. But if you don't want to use, like I've seen decks just run, like the versions just run like all Parallels or like all D-Valleys. Those decks play a little bit differently. The D-Valley one, it's more like toolboxy, but right now I'm going for the split. And finally, go on to the energies. 4 DCE, 4 Psychic, and 1 Rainbow. The 1 Rainbow is to turn on Berserk, basically. If you want to go like turn 1 attach Drampa, then like turn 2, like you could attach like Rainbow to like Trubbish or something, and then turn 3 you're attacking with a 150 to 180 Berserk. It's like the common scenario. Other times, like you just pop on the Rainbow energy, at some point, just to have that 10 damage on, to have the Drampa take a Berserk late in the game, stuff like that. The Dex doesn't really want to, because the attacks for Trash, like a Trash Dance only takes one Psychic, so having a high count of energy doesn't seem necessary, but especially since we already have Super Rod to continue recycling those back into the deck. But you could probably like fiddle around with the numbers, and like I'd say add maybe one more Psychic. I did run 5 at one point, but I felt like I saw the Psychic too much, and I could have would have wanted like something else in the deck. But I think depends on your playstyle. So that's it for Drampa Garb. Honestly, I've been playing a similar deck list to this online a lot, and it does struggle against a lot of decks. Of course, Expand, you have a ton of cards to choose from. There's a huge card pool, and that means there's a lot of strong decks out there and strong archetypes that could go really fast. And I think this deck has trouble against fast decks where they can start getting damaging quick, or they have a quick setup. A couple decks that come to mind are Trevenant. Trevenant's still a big threat despite the Wally banning. Even like the fighting decks that you'd think would be a good matchup, if they run some Pokemon that don't have fighting weakness like Zygarde or something like that, they could really take control of the game really quick. And also, don't forget, Drampa's weak to the fighting, so you're gonna have to play around those matchups sometimes, or sometimes you can't even afford to and have to bench a Drampa. Again, Zoroark, like the Zoroark matchups, there's variants like Zoroark is still around, it seems to be like, and Zoroark like in Rock. There's Zoroark Garbodor, which seems to be like, I've heard that basically replaces this deck. It could really, any Zoroark deck you could really prey upon, so that's one of its like even or like slightly favored matchups, depending on like how your hand sculpts out, but usually it's a little bit favored. Stuff like Greninja, if you wanted to, you could tech Giratina. That's in my deck online. I believe I shaved Oricorio for a Giratina because I just don't want to deal with Greninjas really. But yeah, there's a lot of decks that in expanded right now, especially in the vacuum of a new format. This deck doesn't seem as solid as it once was, simply because it loses a lot of percentage points in the Zoroark matchup simply in representation. But it still has powerful attacks and Trash Lance, powerful abilities, and Garbodor Toxin, and huge damage and Stalin Berserk and Riotous Edge, or Riotous Beating, sorry. But another thing I want to say is that this deck, probably like its old form, it's kind of difficult to pilot because sometimes you need to look at how you gotta keep track of your opponent's items and see if you have like exact damage or just enough damage. You don't need to be doing like 400 damage all the time. Another thing is this deck can brick a lot. I've had a lot of hands where it's like you have VS Seeker and like a ton of Pokemon and like since you run 8 items, like you could just draw multiple items. And with a thin line of like one supporter, it's kind of hard to find those when they're prized. I mean, it's hard to find. You can't really get them when they're prized, so it's really frustrating sometimes. And with the heavier lines on the Trubbish Garbodor line, that 2-2 split does come back to bite you sometimes, especially if you're trying to string. If you need to string Garbodor knockouts, but one is prize and you're desperately trying to get it off like the first and second prizes that your Drampa or Garbodor can take, it becomes really hard to keep the pressure going. And sometimes if your opponent can recover from that, it's like a game from there. So I hope, I'm by no means, by the way, like an expert on this deck. It is difficult to pilot, so I'd like to hear any suggestions you'd have on playing it or in certain matchups, or any cuts that you'd make to this deck. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good night.